Let's get you to Alaska with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She's in Anchorage ahead of tomorrow's summit. Also with us, former Biden State Department spokesperson Ned Price and Counsel on Foreign Relations President Emeritus Richard Haass. Monica, we're starting to learn how things are going to play out tomorrow. What will be discussed? Walk us through it.
Exactly, Anna. It's going to be, it sounds like, a lengthy meeting between Russia and the United States tomorrow. We know that President Trump and President Putin will have some one-on-one time. And of course, that's really significant because what is discussed there's an open question of how we will learn about it, what was potentially promised, what could potentially come out of that, and how that's messaged is the real key question to this incredibly consequential face-to-face, even though the White House is downplaying some expectations about what could come out of it. Now, after they meet together, which it could be a lengthy amount of time, we don't know, we'll see, the two delegations will then meet with their top senior officials, and they will work through that bilateral session for another extended amount of time. And then we know, the Kremlin announced it first, and the White House confirmed it this morning, that then the two men will have a joint press conference. Now, remember back to when they last stood side by side and answered some questions back in Helsinki, where, of course, the president notably took the side of Vladimir Putin over the intelligence community. So that, of course, will be a very high stakes moment. But again, the White House is trying to set the stakes low here, saying that this is a feel out meeting. This is a listening exercise, in the words of White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. The president himself said that he would know perhaps within the first 2 minutes of sitting down with President Putin whether this would be a worthwhile discussion to see if they can get to any kind of potential ceasefire here. But the real question is, what are the specifics that might be nailed down tomorrow ahead of then what would be the next phase of this, which could be a meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky, who, of course, for now is not expected to be a part of these talks here in Anchorage tomorrow. Anna.
Ned, we know that the president of Russia will be traveling with quite a large group of people, including the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, foreign affairs aide, defense minister, finance minister, special envoy for investment. What's your reaction to the makeup of the Russian delegation and this idea for a joint presser after Trump to stand side by side with someone who invaded an ally whose country is widely considered a cybersecurity threat to the U.S.? Is all this standard?
Well, both are incredibly problematic, Anna. First, on the delegation itself, for the American president to meet one-on-one, presumably with interpreters in the room with the Russian president, we've seen this before and only once before, and that's been in Donald Trump's first term. Leaving aside what President Trump might say or might share with President Putin, it is incredibly dangerous to do this because literally no one else is going to know what was said. It is not the job of the interpreter to take notes. It's the job of the interpreter to share the language, to make sure they understand one another. If there are no notes circulated to the Secretary of State, to the Defense Department, to the intelligence community, the U.S. government won't be able to operationalize or even to know what the two leaders discussed. To your second element, look, the press conference is equally problematic. You can fault President Trump for having the summit for a number of reasons. He's doing so without President Zelensky. He's doing so without any concrete, viable, and certainly just proposal on the table. But he's also giving President Putin what he wants. And President Putin, ever since President Obama called Russia a regional power, has wanted nothing more than to be on the world stage with the American president. He covets this platform, this literal platform right next to the president of the United States. And to have these two men standing next to one another, literally on the same plane, answering questions from reporters, well, that's already a victory for Vladimir Putin. And that's even before whatever comes out of President Trump's mouth. Of course, we saw this in July of 2018. We know how that ended, with President Trump siding with President Putin, the guy next to him, over the U.S. intelligence community. That gives me real concern about what we're going to see tomorrow.
Richard, today, Putin previewed the meeting, saying the Trump administration is making, quote, quite energetic and sincere efforts to stop the hostilities, stop the crisis, and reach agreements that are of interest to all parties involved in this conflict. Richard, Putin knows what President Trump sees as a win. Trump wants to be able to say he ended the war. How will Putin use that to his advantage going into this talk when he has this face-to-face, potentially just he and Trump in the room together with no one else?
Well, it's always dangerous in negotiations to want an agreement too much. And one has to hope that President Trump's enthusiasm or desire to be a successful peacemaker doesn't get out of hand, and that he signs on to an agreement that essentially gives Putin what he wants. And Putin is interested not just in territory, let's be honest. He wants to weaken Ukraine as an independent, sovereign entity. Ukraine's very existence is a thorn in his side because Ukraine is a Slavic country that is democratic with ties to the West. So Putin has a big agenda. His fallback agenda probably is if he can't get a ceasefire or an agreement on his terms, he doesn't want to be blamed for it. He would like the United States to put pressure on Ukraine rather than on him. And I think, that clearly his agenda is very different than ours. And I think the real concern that a lot of people have, in addition to the optics of the meeting, is whether if President Trump can't get the agreement he wants, to what extent does he take it out on Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukraine and penalize them rather than Putin and Russia?
Monica, the battle wages on in Ukraine for territory. President Trump reportedly told Zelensky and European leaders he's not going to talk to Putin about divvying up territory, but he still thinks he can get a ceasefire?
Well, that's what's notable, Anna, because remember that in a press conference earlier this week, the president said, yeah, there would be some, quote, land swapping between the two, but he didn't elaborate on that. And now we are learning from European officials and others who were briefed on that phone conversation that took place yesterday that the president did indicate that this wouldn't be about territorial negotiation without Ukraine at the table, that that's not something essentially that he was going in looking to do. But of course, there's the concern from some European officials that certainly that is something that perhaps could be agreed to. It's a little bit unclear. But here's how the president is framing what could come out of this meeting tomorrow and what might be next on the agenda. Listen.
If the first one goes okay, we'll have a quick second one. I would like to do it almost immediately. And we'll have a quick second meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky and myself if they'd like to have me there.
Russia face any consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to stop the war after your meeting on Friday?
Yes, they will. Yeah.
What will the consequences
there will be
be?
consequences.
Sanctions, tariffs?
There will be, I don't have to say, there will be very severe consequences.
Now, in the past, that had been something in the form of secondary sanctions, that is possibly going after countries that do big business with Russia. We've seen an example of that already with India. So could there be more of that? The president saying yes. But again, they're going into this seeing if the talks can be laid out in a way that a ceasefire could be achieved. But again, that second half of the puzzle is so critical here, Anna. And we don't know yet if President Putin will agree to meet with President Zelensky and perhaps President Trump again once this is all said and done tomorrow.
Ned, you write in Foreign Policy, rather than bow to an American ultimatum, Putin has instead engineered a trap. What kind of trap? How do you see this?
Well, Anna, we've heard what President Trump wants to get out of this, and the White House is really downplaying expectations. But I think we have to recognize that President Putin is also going in with his own plans and objectives. And just as I wrote, I think his plan is to set a trap for President Trump, really to achieve two goals. Number one is to take the pressure off, and number two is to keep the pressure off once and for all. On that first goal, we're talking about this summit tomorrow on Friday. Let's talk for a second about last Friday, what was supposed to have happened. And that is the day, the self-imposed deadline, when President Trump was to have imposed, by his own telling, sanctions and tariffs against Russia if President Putin didn't stop the war. Of course, President Putin didn't stop the war. And instead of sanctions and tariffs, he was rewarded with this summit. President Putin wants to use this to continue to string him along to make sure that pressure doesn't materialize. But number two, and Richard was referring to this earlier, I think President Putin has an even more ambitious goal. I think he's been somewhat concerned over the past few weeks as President Trump uncharacteristically has said charitable things and actually even done charitable things vis-a-vis Ukraine. President Putin wants to use this summit to once again flip the script. I think he's going to present a proposal that he will dress in the guise of reasonability. It will sort of be a land swap, something to really cater to President Trump's real estate mogul sensibilities, something that on its face might seem fair to President Trump, but will really just set up Russia to occupy for going out at least 20% of Ukrainian territory. It will bar Ukraine from having the defenses and deterrence capabilities it will need going forward, and it will just set up a dynamic where this will happen again and again. Russia might rest, refit, and ultimately reattack if this is ultimately something that President Trump accedes to, whether in this meeting or down the line.
I mean, it certainly sounded like coming out of his call with European leaders, with Zelensky yesterday, that he was saying all the right things that they wanted to hear during their meeting and following it as well. We just heard him threatening, quote, very severe consequences. And allies in Europe seem to think that will mean new sanctions against Russia. Richard, do you think sanctions work? It's been over 3 years, hasn't stopped Putin yet.
In a word, no. Indeed, the secondary sanctions don't penalize Russia so much as countries like India. We're not prepared to introduce secondary sanctions against China because they could cut off rare earth minerals to us. Well, no, let's just be straight here. If you want to have severe consequences for Russia, there's a very simple way to do it, is to provide significant arms and intelligence support for Ukraine so Russia can't win on the battlefield, it can't advance, and we would give Ukraine the ability to bring the war to Russia, to basically impose some costs on Russia the way Russia's been attacking Ukraine. Unfortunately, the vice president seems to have ruled that out this week, but those would be the serious consequences, and that would get Putin's attention because that would shake his confidence that time works in his favor. So the real serious consequence we have to be prepared to put on the table is long-term, meaningful support for Ukraine. And I would just simply say, at best, that's an open question, but there's not a lot of reason to be confident we're prepared to do that.